Around and all right, everybody, welcome along. I'm Adam Selzer for Mysterious Chicago Tours. I've been a tour guide and historian here in Chicago for going on 20 years. I've got about a dozen Chicago history books out. Most recently, the brand new Graceland Cemetery, Chicago Stories, Symbols, and Secrets, new from University of Illinois Press. Also in the past year, we have had Murder Maps USA from Thames and Hudson. Several years back was Mysterious Chicago, the book, H. Holmes, The True History of the White City Devil. And I was just at the bookseller in Lincoln Square, and they had a poster on the wall for Smart Aleck's Guide to American History, which is like a 15-year-old book at this point. I was amazed to still see that up on a wall someplace. But today we are going to be doing a virtual tour, as we've been doing the last couple of years, of Rose Hill Cemetery in autumn. I figured I was about to list a Rose Hill tour for Cemetery. We've been doing all Graceland since the book came out, but we'll do Rose Hill in a couple of weeks since we got some time coming up, and that'll be like 1 week before Mystericon at the end of the month. So lots of great stuff coming up. I decided I would do the version virtually of Rose Hill in autumn, filmed a couple of years ago when the leaves were at their absolute peak, because right now they are not at their peak, and I am mad. I'm a little bit salty about the fact that it's meteorological autumn right now. It is September, but it's hot outside, and I am mad. I know it happens every September. September is a trap for those of us who don't care for hot weather. We are going to go ahead and get started now. Just briefly, I'm going to turn my screen mirroring back on for a second, which kind of messes me up a little, just so I can get the screen recording going. And we'll just record a second or so as we go off in to Rose Hill Cemetery for Chicago's Stories, Symbols, and Secrets. So these are the gates of Rose Hill Cemetery, designed by W. W. Boyington. And we'll make our way right inside here to see a guy who helped found Rose Hill Cemetery. The first president was a guy by the name of James Van Zandt Blaney, who is perhaps most famous for helping to convict a guy by the name of George W. Green, pictured here, who poisoned his wife. Dr. Van Zandt Blaney went through all of his wife's body, found traces of what appeared to be strychnine, and said, "I have examined the crystal residues under a microscope of high power, under which they presented the appearance of four-sided prisms, that being the scene under which." You see where we're going here. He actually tried to get the jury to drink the liquid which had drained from the organs. They did not take him up on it. But having reburied Mrs. Green, probably back in the backyard where she was buried in the first place, and burying George Green after he hanged himself in prison in the old city cemetery where Lincoln Park is now, Dr. Van Zandt Blaney apparently decided, hey, we got to get a proper cemetery around here, and became the first president of Rose Hill when they opened a few years later. So we'll just move in the autumn time. I've actually got, the nice rustling leaves here. One of the first things that you come to, it's usually the last thing on my tours when we do the red route that we've been doing for most of the last several years. We're going to come up to a guy by the name of Ferd Peck up over here. Ferdinand Peck. Now, most of these graves are pretty similar. They don't really have anything other than the names and dates, other than Ferd Peck, who says, "This man had courage." And I will just about guarantee you that he came up with that one himself. Ferd Peck was a man in Chicago who is best remembered now as a real estate developer. He built things like the Congress Hotel back when it was called the Auditorium, but insisted on being called Commodore Peck. That was not a military title, it was what they called him at the yacht club. Had a lot of stories about like riding in a carriage with Abraham Lincoln to his second inauguration, which, if he was there at the time, nobody wrote it down at the time that I can find. There's some great stories about the guy. One time he got lost inside of the Congress Hotel, and the kid who was with him said, "Well, gosh, Commodore Peck, didn't you build this place?" And he said, "Well, I built it, but I'll be damned if I'm the man who put the numbers on all of the doors." Now, late in his life, they decided that he was the oldest Chicagoan. Not the oldest man in town by any means, but the person who had been in Chicago the longest. So they let him play mayor for a day. And he immediately got on the phone, got the sheriff, and said, "Sheriff, this is Mayor Commodore Peck. I hereby order you to ignore all prohibition laws." So finally, a mayor that we can be proud of. And we'll move on just a bit from here and really take advantage of this autumn weather up over here. All right, I think I've got about enough just about enough screen sharing audio here. We're going to hit the button one more time. Sorry for the delay here, but they wanted me to get some footage for an upcoming news story. It's kind of nice to have some footage of what this was all like anyway. We're all just using VR glasses to do it in a few years, am I right? Okay, just quick screenshot while I'm looking cool. And we'll click record a little bit. So this is a really gorgeous one. I always want to call it Art Deco. It's really more Art Nouveau than anything else. This is a guy by the name of Perkins Bass. Now, there's a thing that I've related a lot of times. After the Great Chicago Fire, there was a lot of controversy about what we could do to stop this from happening again. Perkins Bass was a big supporter of using more... I'm going to turn my own audio up here. I'm a little bit low. Perkins Bass was a big supporter of using more bricks and less wood. One guy actually came into a city council meeting, held up a brick and a block of wood, and said, "Do you really mean to tell me that a brick is harder to burn than wood?" And everybody kind of looked at him and said, "Yes." And so finally they tried to set fire to both. The wood caught, the brick didn't. The guy actually changed his mind, which is something that may have never really happened inside of a city council meeting before. Certainly hasn't happened since. Perkins Bass was also specifically pointed to by Wilbur F. Story, the editor of the Chicago Times, as being one of the people who was helping Lincoln rig and steal the election. You all know what we think about Wilbur F. Story around here. We're going to move just behind this guy. Here, I got some leaf audio here that maybe you can hear. I don't know if that works or not. The rustling leaves sound. But over here is this boulder for a guy by the name of Ebenezer Peck. Now, Ebenezer Peck came down from Montreal and ended up serving in state government with Lincoln. At the time, he was still wearing coonskin caps to go to government meetings, which nobody ever thought that those things looked good. But eventually, he bought himself a mansion in Chicago just above where Lincoln Park would be today. Some interesting pictures of it that still survive up in the archives. The house itself, of course, is long gone, but is best remembered for the fact that Lincoln was connected to Ebenezer Peck. Here's a letter from Peck to Lincoln that's still preserved. Here's Peck writing to Lincoln about the possibility of the Confederates and the British forming their own alliance. It was actually in this mansion after the election in 1860 that Lincoln sat down and decided who was going to be in the cabinet, who was going to be the Secretary of War, who was going to be the Secretary of State. Sitting down and hanging out for the first time with Hannibal Hamlin as vice president. They'd been elected without ever really formally being introduced. Now, one thing we'll notice over the course of this is a lot of these people claim some connection or another to Abraham Lincoln. In the late 19th century in Chicago, your connection to Abraham Lincoln was absolutely coin of the realm around here. And, I'm going to turn off the screen mirroring now. I think I've got enough. I'm going to stop pushing all of these buttons all the time. From here, well, as we'll see, some of these guys were telling the truth, some were not, but everybody had to have some kind of connection to Abraham Lincoln. It was just coin of the realm. And here's something cool, is back behind here, back behind Ebenezer are some older graves for his parents and one of his sons. I can't really read the dates on that, but I'm imagining that Sarah Peck would have been very old. I don't know if these are, I don't know if these are connected to the Ferdinand Peck at all. There's Peck plots all over this place. Here a Peck, there a Peck, Peck a little, talk a little, cheap, 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 talk a lot, Peck a little more. Let's just move over to the side of it. A good thing the screen mirroring was off. I'm just going to send him a couple of seconds worth of clips in the end. Right over here is a marker for a guy by the name of William Duvall, who, according to the gravestone, and this is a very new gravestone just from the last couple of years, but the gravestone very specifically says that he was a Revolutionary War soldier. They even give his unit the Continental Line, which, if you were in the Continental Line, that meant that you had money for the most part. If there was actually somebody in the Continental Line here, we would probably know about it. They were pretty diligent in the old days about keeping track of who all of the veterans were. The first indication ever that this guy was ever a Revolutionary War soldier was Just pausing for a still there. Sorry about that. I'm done now. I got all the pictures I need. First an occasion we have was just his gravestone, which at the time, the older one just said Soldier of the Revolution. It didn't really elaborate on which revolution it was. It might not have been the American one at all. It might have been some metaphorical religious revolution. But this is a picture from the 1950s when people first started really getting interested in it. At the time, Rose Hill said they had no records on the guy whatsoever. They assumed he had been moved from the old city cemetery, but didn't have any records at all. And diligent searches have not been able to connect this to any William Duvall who actually fought in the Revolution. There were Williams Duvall in the fight, but they don't seem to have been this one. In fact, the guy who was in the Continental Line definitely is not the one who was buried right here. He's down in Virginia someplace. So it's one of those mysteries. The only Revolutionary War soldier buried in the Chicago city limits that I can verify is No America over at Graceland, who is part of the Graceland book these days. Martin, I like that idea. He was in Prince's band, The Revolution. And all seven, and we'll watch them fall. You stand in the way of love, and we will smoke them. I was just thinking about recording a cover of that with my band, The Limited Time. So I'm like one song away from going from EP to album, so I just wanted to show this one off because it's very neat looking. There's a lot of these that are not particularly legible anymore. And Rose Hill is not quite as easy going with their paperwork these days, so it's hard for me to figure out who these people might have been. But it's just such a gorgeous shot here with all of the leaves in the background. You gotta come, usually it's about the first week of November that the leaves really hit their peak around here. We'll make our way over a little bit, and I often talk about the 7th grade effect at cemeteries, in which all these monuments to death kind of trigger our inner 7th grader as just kind of a defense mechanism. It's a process of distancing death, keeping it away from us. If we laugh at death a bit, it loses some of its power over us. So we find ourselves chuckling at names like Abraham Titsworth. Layla just sent me a picture of a grave, Fuchs. You know how that one is pronounced. But, that can actually lead us to some interesting research stuff here. Abraham Titsworth turns out to have been a tailor who sewed the inauguration suit, the suit that Lincoln wore to his first inauguration. That's an interesting thing. When Lincoln was receiving people over at the Tremont House Hotel, quite a number of people were lining up to see him. One tailor shop actually said, hey, while everybody else is in line, why don't you come over and get yourself a coat? We'll move over from here a little bit. Today we're just focusing more on aesthetics than anything else, than any particular theme, any kind of geography. So really this is the kind of a tour that we would never do in person because it bounces around all over the place. Right here. We often talk about Philip Armour of Armour Hot Dogs over at Graceland. I really wish he was in the same cemetery as Oscar Mayer. But Oscar Mayer is up here at Rose Hill, a couple of miles north of Graceland Cemetery. Oscar Mayer, of course, is the Oscar Mayer wiener guy. He got his start with a butcher shop down in Old Town, Oscar Mayer's German Wieners, while we're in the 7th grade section anyway. Here he is advertising his fine sausage, hams, bacon, and beef in pure kettle-rendered lard. During the war, they were always looking for people to fill in work. They needed mixers and boners and washers and smokers and butchers and laborers and hog pullers and steam fitters and other things that once you're in the 7th grade mindset strike you as absolutely hilarious. People always want food. You see this a lot. Mr. Kranz, who has a mausoleum over at Graceland, when asked about the tariff wrecking the economy, said, well, people are still going to eat candy. But, we can't really talk about Oscar Mayer without bringing up the song, because I know it's stuck in your head already.
Class attention. Forward march. Oh, I'd love to be an Oscar Mayer wiener.
Everybody.
That is what I truly like to be. 'Cause if I were an Oscar Mayer wiener, everyone would be in love with me. A big parade is so inspiring.
Now, honestly, I don't think they were really playing that much in the 80s by the time I was a kid. I know that song more from The Simpsons than from any actual commercials. And once again here, everybody, for those of you just joining us, this was actually filmed about 2 years ago in early November. The leaves haven't really started changing yet here either. We're just showing it like this today to kind of will spooky season, will Halloween into existence. Yesterday I was walking around and it was entirely too hot for doing a tour in September. These things happen. But Rose Hill, in particular, when the leaves are at their peak, just looks absolutely fantastic. Graceland does as well. They all do, really. But once the leaves hit their peak, I'm out there with the camera looking for the coyotes just about every day. If you go to adamchicago.com, there's a link to the coyote calendar for 2023 cemetery coyotes. This is the son of a guy by the name of Conrad Collar. Now, we don't know too much about the son. Often it happens when we get a statue of some child. Children don't make the news very much unless somebody wrote a diary or something in those days. Finding any actual data about the kids can be very, very tricky. We know a lot more about his father, Conrad Collar, who ran the printing press for the Chicago Tribune at the time of the Great Chicago Fire. So his job was to go find the new printing press, whatever it cost. They heard a rumor of a guy on the west side who had a printing press out in his barn. So Collar was sent out there, basically being ordered to buy it no matter what the guy wanted for it. And he wanted a lot of money for that printing press. But because of his efforts, even after the Chicago Tribune burned down in the Great Chicago Fire, they had an issue back on the streets within a day or so. It's really pretty impressive. We'll move around over here to the Bross family. The Bross family is still just had a burial at Rose Hill very recently. We kind of interfered with them a little bit. We didn't interfere. We always stay away from burials. But William Bross, well, he looked like this. We'll just say this facial hair is utterly mighty. But he was the publisher of a paper called the Democratic Press. Though he eventually gave up on the Democratic Party. In the 1850s, though, we'd hear about, back in those days, the Democrats supported slavery. It was well, not early on. It was kind of spread between the two parties. It wasn't until after the Kansas-Nebraska Act that things really started dividing along party lines. At that point, he left the party behind, as a lot of people did. And then, of course, if you still think that we should be basing our things on 8 platforms from 1860, I don't really know what to tell you. But so many people write to me and think it's a really sick burn. Like I don't spend half of my time reading 1860 newspapers. He published the Democratic Press, but through various mergers eventually became the Chicago Tribune. And this was a thing at the time. They were kind of a middle-of-the-road paper. He was generally anti-slavery, but abolition was a little bit further along for most people at the time. Most people thought that it was not really practical to outright end slavery by itself. But every time they suggested anything about slavery not spreading any further or anything that might inconvenience the slave power in any way, people like Senator Douglas would start crying, "Abolitionist, abolitionist." Very similar to a century later, like anytime we thought that their tax code should change or that the school should be better. Socialism, socialism. Same sort of thing. But we'll move along here a bit. Welcome, Laura. Better late than never, indeed. Yeah, I got to admit that Bross sketch is just the worst. Rather harsh shadow on this statue for a guy by the name of Julius White, who was eventually a Civil War general, though by no account a particularly good one. What he may be best remembered for is he was a businessman in Chicago, and in 1860, Abraham Lincoln, just about 6 weeks before he was nominated for president, was in town working as a lawyer, and Julius White convinced him to come up to Evanston and stay a night at his house. So he had Lincoln up there in Evanston for a day. They rode the train that would have gone right past Rose Hill Cemetery, which at the time was still brand new, only a couple of gravestones probably even standing at the time, but they would have gone right by it. And one of our morning mini tours, we kind of triangulated the location where the house was. It was right about where the YWCA is now on Ridge. So Lincoln gave a little speech on the porch, had a little talk, and while he was in town as well, he tried to get out of having going up to Mr. White's house because he had a previous commitment that he eventually managed to honor with Leonard Volk, the sculptor. Now, orally, there is not really an enslaved person's graveyard specifically in Chicago, but there are a number of people around here that we know were enslaved at one point or another. We actually just, we're working on getting gravestones for the ones that are not marked. It's just kind of scattered. There's never like a specific section for him here. But this is Leonard Volk, who was a sculptor, who in 1858, Senator Douglas and Lincoln got along reasonably well in between calling each other every name in the book in their debates. And Douglas had posed for a life mask from Mr. Volk, the sculptor, and he said, "Lincoln, Lincoln, I know you love getting your picture taken, so why don't you go see this guy Volk and get a whole life mask made?" And about 2 hours into the process, Lincoln was thinking, "That jerk." It was a very unpleasant process, but he made a whole life mask of Abraham Lincoln. He also made this death mask of Senator Douglas a couple of years later when he died at the Tremont House Hotel. Very creepy looking. And once they had the Lincoln bust, they had it made up like this. I've seen two copies of this. There's one at the Union League building here in Chicago, and there is one at the gift shop outside of Lincoln's house in Springfield, over at the Lincoln Museum. Well, not really the Lincoln Museum. It's the gift shop by the house. There's another copy of the life cast of him from which that was based. This is another Leonard Volk that they think might be Mary Lincoln, but it's kind of difficult to tell. There's an interesting article here. It's gratifying to know that in spite of the rude shocks of war, the ups and downs of the gold thermometer, the exciting fluctuations of trade, the high price of bread and butter, kerosene, coal, and beefsteaks, the existence of enrolling officers, provost marshals, rebel rays, copperheads, and other necessary luxuries, the artists, those dwellers in utopia, bohemia, in the realms of beauty, still nourish with faith in commissions like grains of mustard seed, and with macabre-ish hopes of something yet to turn up, which shall reward them for their devotion to nature and faithful and persistent efforts to reproduce her fitful moods upon canvas. Art has not yet taken firm root in our ungrateful western soil, but the pioneers are yet active, persevering, determined. Basically, it's, so, isn't it nice that with a war going on, some people are still just painting pretty pictures? Look, it has always been fun for newspapers to make fun of hipsters. Forever. This is a little bit of an article that talked about him. I do love the macabre reference, though. Something will turn up. I've pretty much lived my life by the macabre term of what something will come up. Well, right across from Mr. Volk. Thank you, Anne. Right across from Mr. Volk, we've got this one. This is in white bronze. This looks like it's all made out of stone, but if you tap on it, it is actually hollow. It's made out of zinc, but they called it white bronze because that sold better than calling it zinc. This is a guy by the name of Philetus Gates who ran a quarry and a foundry, had some device called a rattle box that his neighbors really hated. They tried to sue him over it. I don't know what a rattle box was, but I can use context clues and make a pretty good guess. He was also a big supporter of Seth Payne. I just found this out from Nancy Schum's new biography of Seth Payne. I may or may not be heading out to Lake Zurich right after this for the second half of her meeting. Her publicist has been very insistent. But Seth Payne was a guy once described in the papers as a queer chicken. He was an Underground Railroad worker, a spiritualist who started a bank where he would hire mediums to talk to the ghost of Alexander Hamilton. Also a feminist and a vegetarian years before such things became popular. Just got a grave marked up at Graceland Cemetery, but Philetus Gates gave him a lot of jobs and gave him a lot of support over the years. Now, Philetus was a pretty common name at the time. I wonder if it's similar, like a root word to, like, philatelist, stamp collectors. Just saw a great line, yeah, John Lennon, imagine there's no countries. You know how bad that would be for stamp collectors? This is the elk of a guy by the name of Baker, and I assumed he was a member of the Elks Club or something. He's actually not. He was, he published a financial newspaper. That's about it. The elk is probably just there because his family thought it looked cool. Somebody has added sticks to serve as the antlers, which have been gone for a long time. And of course, there's a group of about 24 deer who live at Rose Hill full time. If you drive around, you'll almost always bump into them. If you come on the tour on September 17th, pretty good chance we're going to see some deer. Here we have the Couch family. Now, the Couches are probably best known today for still having a mausoleum in Lincoln Park. Just last night, I had yet another dream about seeing the inside of that place. I have these pretty regularly, dreams where I see what it's like inside of the Couch tomb. We've only gotten as far as the interior door so far. The Couches ran the Tremont House Hotel. Ira, who is probably still in Lincoln Park, even though his name is here, and James, his brother, who lived way into the 1890s. Lived into his 90s until he was hit by a streetcar. But they ran the Tremont House Hotel, where Abraham Lincoln spoke, where Senator Douglas died, where John Wilkes Booth stayed for a couple of years in '62. And their great-great-great-granddaughter was actually able to give me a copy of their wine list from 1879, from New Year's Eve, showing how many bottles they had, how much it cost. I'm not enough of a wine guy to know what any of this means, but it's really cool to see anyway. And I'm going to show that off in a video clip. So what I'm going to do really quickly here is I'm going to put the screen mirroring thing back on just for a second and get a shot of that thing turning up. I want people to see what kind of stuff it is that we do here. And that does include showing things like old ephemera, wine lists. This is James Couch, who ran the Tremont House Hotel. Now, Ira's over on the left. They've also got markers for his parents, James, Ira, and Mehitable McGee Couch. We'll just show this was the Tremont House's wine list right here. Champagne, red, whatever you want. This all looks like it was really expensive to me, though. Well, that didn't work correctly. Yeah, Charlie Chaplin definitely crashed in the couch tomb a couple of times. This was the wine list. All right, that should do it. Sorry about the delay there, but you're all going to be famous. I don't know, usually sometimes we do all this build-up for a TV thing and it's just 2 minutes where they ask me about Inez Clark and don't seem to realize that her name was Briggs. Arlie, I've never seen the coyotes hunting in packs before. I've normally only seen like one of them at a time with anything to eat. But they do pretty well. They're not quite as common at Rose Hill as they are at Graceland. Move down over here a little bit. Yeah, here's some of the deer. Now, they asked me for the TV thing, do you have any videos of yourself doing the tour? I'm like, not really. I'm out there filming all the time, but nobody's ever filming me. Now, I am working on a TikTok right now, the Adam Chicago TikTok, that'll show the insides of mausoleums. Some of which I'm probably not supposed to show, so I'm not going to say which cemetery or which mausoleum. This is Eliza Chapel Porter, who was the first teacher in Chicago, and also did a little bit of work on the Underground Railroad. According to a biography written by her daughter, there was a time when they were living up in Wisconsin and got a message, there's a few escapees coming, can you hide them out for a couple of days in the lighthouse before the ship comes? So they did, but then the ship was late, which caused a lot of complications. In the book it says, so many exciting and hilarious incidents happened that I laughed just thinking about it. But then she doesn't say what any of those are. She just goes right back to talking about how pious her mother was, which is fairly common in things like this. They would get really, really into just talking about how pious everybody was and skip over a lot of the rest. Take a quick look over here at the Civil War section. Mr. Ransom, just above us here, General Ransom, who insisted on, even having been shot and near death several times, insisted on being on the march through Georgia, the march to the sea. Though he died of dysentery in the middle of it, having pooped his way through Georgia. While we were pooping through Georgia. These ones in front have just been replaced since I filmed this. And back over here is Irving Carson, the first journalist to be killed in war, kind of the Han Solo of the war. He was a scout. He would sneak into places. He would row to a Confederate camp dressed up as a local farmer, say, gosh, I was thinking of joining. Can I take a look at this fort a little bit? And then he'd be back to give General Grant a whole map of the fortifications later on. Was also writing all this down for the Chicago Tribune, though identifying which things are by him has been very difficult. They didn't have individual bylines back then. Though it seems like his are the ones that are loaded with puns. guns. We can identify some of them based on that. He eventually took a cannonball to the head in the Battle of Shiloh, and he's buried way away from the other Battle of Shiloh victims. He's with guys who died like 3 years later. I think they had set him apart, planning to give him a really big monument at one point. That just happened sometimes, that the war kept going and the stories fell through the cracks to a large extent. We'll take a quick look up here to the Pollard family, who are a little too off of the route to go on any of the walking tour routes so far. But the Pollards were the first black family to settle up here in Rogers Park. This is John Pollard when he was younger. I'm not sure if he was born enslaved. I want to say that he was, but he ended up joining the United States Colored Troops and served as a drummer boy. There's a picture of him from years later. Picture of him when he was involved in like reunion groups later on, but eventually moved to Rogers Park, having been a drummer boy in the Civil War. And then one of his sons, Hughes Pollard, became a jazz drummer later on. Now, I think that's just fantastic. I haven't been able to find any recordings of John Pollard, who is buried here. There's a recording of his group that I found circulating, but you can't hear any drums on it, which makes it rather tricky. But it's still a very cool thing to find. Their house is still standing. There's a park named after them. There's a movement to have a few more things named after them around here. In particular, Fritz, a son of theirs, was one of the first black professional quarterbacks. Still very well known in football circles. I believe they're going to be renaming a field after him over at Lane Tech High School, not too far from here. Not a minute too soon. These leaves look so good this year. This was 2020. When we walked around and filmed all of this. This is Colonel Wyman, who now has a new plaque with a picture of him on it on the other side of this. Colonel Wyman was also in the Civil War. He was at the Battle of Chickasaw Bayou, and in the morning he was seen looking out over the field, and his men said, "Sir, watch out, there are snipers everywhere." And he said, "Boys, they haven't cast the bullet that could hit me." You all know exactly what happened next. But there's a terrific account of him on his deathbed, saying something like the full cyclone of his soul burst forth, and the most fearsome imprecations passed from his lips, accompanied by the froth of soon oncoming death. This is a really fancy way of dying, saying that he died cussing his brains out, cussing out all of the rebels. You often hear that these guys only cared about preserving the Union, and certainly in some cases that was it, but we also have guys who died cursing the accursed slaveholders' rebellion. Everybody knew what was going on back then. Oh yeah, you want ASMR? I do have some leaves recordings here. I don't know how loud these are. I tried to get recordings of the leaves clip-clopping along with the footsteps. This is one of the more famous ones here at Rose Hill Cemetery. This is the wife of Harry May. Her name was Mattie. Not too much is known about them. We know that Harry was a baker. That's about it, really. And we have a couple of marriage records on it showing that he was 24 and she was 16. Actually, I think based on other records, she was really 15 at the time, which is awfully young to be getting married to a guy in his 20s, but as these things go in the 19th century, it's not really that bad of an age gap. I've already passed over the Parker grave here. Do I have this one set up? I gotta have it here someplace, I'm sure. Maybe I don't. Or H.O. Stone. Really would have thought I had that in here. I guess she's in just the other famous monument that looks kind of like this, but encased in glass, is in just about every Rose Hill tour anyway. But she was also 16, the other one who's encased in glass, but her husband was into his 40s by then. And when she died, he went back to his hometown and found another bride. He got older. His bride stayed the same age. No, it's not there. It's not there. But this is an interesting one. Right up by the pond here, right up a little bit further back is Charles Dawes, Vice President under Coolidge. Also the writer of the melody of It's All in the Game, making him one of 2 Nobel Prize winners to write a #1 song, the other being Bob Dylan, and 2 members of Congress to write a #1 song, the other being Sonny Bono. His first act as vice president was to make a big speech to the Senate saying, unless you guys get rid of the filibuster, this whole place is a waste of time. But this right in front is Amos Snell, most remembered for his murder most foul. Mr. Snell lived in a mansion, which no longer stands over what was then the West Loop. But late in his life, he started being very paranoid. He thought somebody was coming to kill him. He would spend a lot of time wandering around with his pistol, just waiting for a prowler to show up. And then one night, apparently, one of them did, shot through a door, rifled through the safe, and eventually killed Amos Snell in what became one of the bigger mysteries of the time. Now, personally, I don't think that enough credence has been put into the notion that he might have accidentally shot himself rather than have a burglar break in and do it. That seems to be much more likely to me. Of course, we're dealing with 1880s Chicago police here, so their detective work skills were a little bit lacking. We're also going to finish up now by talking about Coming Cherry briefly. Right behind the giant obelisk to Long John Wentworth. This is, in fact, very much the 7th grade section. Coming Cherry was a geologist at Northwestern. He taught geology but made his money by helping mining companies figure out where the silver was going to be. Being a geologist at the time was a really lucrative gig. If you could show people where the silver was, you were going to end up making an awful lot of money. I know there's recently been one of the cemeteries here that were planning to do another monument like this, or somebody was planning to, but they had a really hard time finding the stone. These days, it's a lot harder to find stone like this. And a lot of people around here also, you'll see a lot of different secret society things, a lot of Freemasons, a lot of Order of Odd Fellows. And this, I believe, is partially Freemasons. But there's a lot going on here. You got the eye, you've got a spade and a pick, you've got what appears to be a telescope. And most notably on top, I don't know if that's a 7 dwarf hat or a poop emoji. Way ahead of his time in any case. But all right, everybody, that takes us right to 10:40, which is about how long I like these to go. So, quick plug for the upcoming things. 2 weeks from now, in person, we'll be doing Rose Hill Cemetery on Saturday, not quite 2 weeks. Saturday the 17th at 11 a.m., Rose Hill Cemetery walking tour. We're not doing any in-person tours next weekend because I got to be at Printers Row at the University of Illinois Press booth, and I've got the next day, the 11th, I will be at Centuries and Sleuths doing a book signing in Forest Park.